Welcome to Pullback, the podcast that digs into the ethics behind everyday things. I'm Kristen Pugh, and I'm here with Kyla Hewson.
Hello.
And today we are joined by Abdul Malik, who is an Edmonton-based journalist, screenwriter, and photographer, as well as co-host of the Off Court podcast. You can listen to the first 2 seasons of that on, I guess, most platforms of choice. Abdul, you can correct me if that's wrong.
Yeah, we're on hiatus right now, unfortunately, but yeah.
We're also, I forgot to say, Kyla, we're members of the Harbinger Media Network of Podcasts, which the Off Court podcast is also a member of. Hooray!
Hey! It's still pretty fresh for us. It's very exciting.
So how's it going, Abdul?
It's going well. I thank you for reminding me I need to change my bio. I've officially dropped photography and screenwriting full time as of January, so that's a incredible life change that I need to put into my info for Andre. But yeah, I'm doing pretty good. Everything, all things considered, it's bright and early on a Sunday morning, and I'm excited to be here. I'm excited to talk as an avid sneakerhead, like really avid sneakerhead, like 350 odd pairs.
Wow.
Is that what your podcast is about?
No.
Sports, Kyla.
Sneakers are sports things.
I guess so.
Oh, they are. But yeah, like the ethics of trade goods, supply chain management, things like that, and I'm fairly involved with like the Writers Guild of Canada and, service-based freelance work and stuff like that. Yeah, I'm excited to talk about it because it definitely all feeds into my interest, right? In terms of what you all talk about.
Kyla and I don't think we've ever done a sports episode before, so I'm really excited about this Olympics one. I think it'll probably, a lot of the same issues that there are with the Olympics really extend to other kinds of sporting events, so I imagine it will have applicability to things like the World Cup and stuff like that. But I guess I first want to start by asking, what's your favorite sport and why?
Basketball. I'm a big basketball guy. I grew up on the, the 2000s Lakers. And obviously I'm from Toronto. I live in Edmonton now, but, I grew up also a Raptors fan. It's for a young South Asian growing up in Canada, I feel, especially in Toronto, like me, hockey is a fairly inaccessible sport for most people unless you're, super loaded.
For sure. Yeah.
And soccer just doesn't cut it because there wasn't, especially when I was growing up, there wasn't the same kind of popularity around soccer like there is, happening right now, actually, right this second. But yeah, yeah, it's one of those things where basketball was very inclusive sport for us, and it's interesting. The fandom in Canada is remarkably different from the fandom for other basketball teams and stuff like that. So yeah, that's my sport of choice.
Nice.
Kristen, what's your favorite sport? Isn't it hockey?
It's my favorite sport to watch for sure. But I also like silly sports.
like Quidditch?
Cricket? Or
bubble soccer, inner tube water polo. The silliest sports that are better than the rest of the
you should check out the ISL, the International Swimming League. It's like an NFL or NBA style league for swimming.
Whoa.
Yeah, it's currently in a huge dispute with the International Swimming Federation, which sees it as a threat to its power. And the crazy thing is, they're both evil, but it's a lot of fun. It's very glitzy, and the talent is actually ferociously good. And if you're in North America, all of their events are free on YouTube for now, which is great.
All right. Love it. Kyla, do you have a favorite sport?
Figure skating.
Ooh. Yeah, never been any scandals in that sport.
Do you do what me and my partner do and ship figure skaters during the Olympics?
Oh my God, yes.
That? Yeah. Okay, yeah.
That's the only sport I watch during the Winter Olympics, honestly. I know, very controversial, but I'm all about that figure skating. I think it's the most technical, the most difficult, and the most beautiful thing to watch, and everything else can just go sit down.
All right, we're here to talk about the Olympics, the 2022 Beijing Winter Olympics. They're just around the corner for us recording, but will have started by the time this episode goes out. And my first question to you, Abdul, is will you be watching the Olympics this year?
I mean, my hot take on the Olympics is that any Olympic event is no less ethical than any other Olympic event. Like as a comprehensive sort of hegemonic institution, the IOC is not only corrupt, but like corrupt and evil and just an absolute just like misery machine for the entire world. So the answer is yes. um,
The answer is fuck it, sure.
yeah, it's one of those things where like I actually really enjoy the idea of the Olympics. The actualization of them is ugly, but like yeah, like we can get into it in a bit. But like a boycott of one Olympic Games in favor of another sort of doesn't see the forest from the trees. Is sort of my sort of thoughts on it.
Gotcha. All right. So I'm curious because I know basically nothing about the IOC. So tell us why they're bad.
So the IOC is this effectively like nepotism patronage style organization that has memberships across, they incorporate members from all the international federations of sport, right? Because every major sport and most minor ones have an international federation, and the IOC exists to enrich the IOC. Right? They sell this idea of prestige and what the Olympics represent. They organize the games, and they will take bribes, kickbacks, anything. They will have these like rules around hosting the Olympics that devastate cities. There's obviously like immense corruption, bribery, kickbacks sort of within the organization itself. And they just don't really give a shit about human rights, about gentrification, about the effect of the environmental impact of hosting the Olympics and things like that, right? Like they are very specifically there to enrich themselves at every level, and everything about the Olympics and the way countries bid for the Olympics, the way the games are executed, sort of represents that.
Yeah, do you mind walking us through sort of how that bidding process works? Hopefully that's not too granular a question.
No, it's not too granular a question, right? Like different cities bid on it, and they present their plans, and the IOC members obviously vote on it, right? Which is where the whole kickback thing comes in. But the IOC has they've relaxed some in recent years due to the fact that it was simply untenable from an optics perspective, right? But they have these like goals of what needs to happen in a bid for the bid to go through, right? And it's things like you need to build X amount of new stadiums. You need to have broadcast plans and like these sorts of ways to promote the Olympics as part of it, right? You need to pay X, Y, and Z. And venue construction is a huge one, right? And then different countries, especially like, countries like say China, right, which have a less than stellar reputation on a global scale. I'm not saying this happened, right? But like countries that are looking to rehabilitate their reputation or sort of make a global impact or make a global statement, right? That's where a lot of kickbacks and stuff do come in. And things like that. Like, we're talking IOC members getting hotels, whatever they want, going places, just suitcases of money and things like that. And it ostensibly it exists to promote internationalism, but like everything it does is with a focus on how can we enrich ourselves at the quite literal human expense of anyone else involved in the games, from the athletes, right, to all the way down to like the workers and the people who just live in these cities and countries. The bidding process is horrific. And it's nice because a lot of cities in the last couple of years, and that's one of the reasons that they started walking back the venue construction rule, among other things, where a lot of cities have just voluntarily or through referendums elected to not submit bids.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Calgary did that recently, right?
Yeah, absolutely, which is wicked because like people are starting to come around on like, oh, the Olympics are devastating, and almost no Olympic Games have been profitable or a net good for any city, from like Brazil's abandoned stadiums to the mass displacement of people before those games. I wrote for Canadian Dimension a while ago. I also wrote about like the way that the Olympics promote a security state, right? Like they are one of the ways that you test out, well, sports in general, right? But they're one of the ways that they test out all sorts of surveillance tech and things like that.
That's interesting. I've never thought about that before.
Yeah, Beijing is asking athletes right now to download an app that will just, it's like ostensibly to be like a vaccine passport, but it's the back end is so open that they're just going to track everything. And so I think the Canadian government is issuing burner phones to the athletes so that they can leave their real phones at home. Like, what?
It's not just that. It's like even in something like I'm trying to remember which games it was, the Athens games, where the Beijing thing is very front facing, but for example, like the first Super Bowl after 9/11 and the next Olympic Games were two of the ways that they piloted facial recognition, surveillance, and passive audio technology. Or at the 2004 games, there was the C4I apparatus, which is developed by an American defense contractor, SAIC, which it stands for Command, Control, Communication, and Integration. It cost 255 million euros to develop, most of that bankrolled by the Greek government as part of the security system for the games. And now it's being sold to countries the world over, right? Like Saudi Arabia bought it. There was a recent agreement where C4I was licensed to U.S. Army forces stationed in South Korea. Yeah, it's the passive surveillance mechanism, and the layer no one talks about in the Olympics is the underlayer that happens at any major event, which is the marketplace, right? This is a place where the rich and powerful will come and sell each other new tech and stuff like that. Just like the reason Calgary Stampede, for example, still exists, right? We're talking sporting events. It is because it is the largest agricultural sciences marketplace in the world, right? That's where people buy like bull semen for $4 million for their herds and things like that, or companies can come and sell, genetically modified beans or whatever to farmers. It's a marketplace, and what most of us see that's public facing is the level above that, right? The games, the
Pancake
stampede, the
breakfasts.
parade, yeah, the pancake breakfast, the endless fucking pancake breakfasts, right? So yeah, like that's like, the Olympics, every angle of the Olympics is just bad. Like it's aside from the feel good stories, which to be fair, they can be very feel good.
True.
Are just ugly, right?
So why are we stuck with the IOC? Why can't we have a worldwide gaming event that isn't run by the IOC? Because I feel like the best part of the games is watching the athletes and hearing those feel good stories, and everything else is just, I mean, I'm pretty sure the Olympics bankrupted Greece. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah, I mean that and the EU's horrible economic policies.
It's a little 1-2 punch, yeah.
Yeah, I mean the two do feed into each other, right? Like if Greece had its own currency, it would never have gotten into that hole, and that was definitely a big part of the way the games like affected the Greek economics. But I mean, many have tried, I'll put it that way. But the Olympics, both as like a cultural totem and a marketing branding opportunity, and like one of the few things that has achieved some sort of international consensus as like a thing that everyone can ostensibly participate in on an international level, to the fact that they have so much money. You know what I mean? Like they have so much money. Like they're basically inevitable at this point. They're a monolith. Like, the USSR tried the Workers' Olympiad. There have been like alternative games held. There are alternative games held every Olympics, right? Just no one gives a shit because those things don't have any sort of real financial backing or real economic power behind them, and the Olympics do. And as even for athletes, right, which is where this all starts with, like athletes, especially athletes in non-major league sports, right? The only thing you're told from childhood, because you start training when you're like 3 years old, right, is the Olympics. That's what your goal is. That's what your goal is to make it to. And it's like, if the athletes decided to all divest and go somewhere else, they could. But unfortunately, like that requires a level of global organization that I would declare not impossible, but I would say that's a multi-decades project.
I mean, the NHL has exited, but not for ethical reasons.
Yeah.
But yeah, what do you think? What do you think an alternative Olympics would look like in an ideal world? Like, let's say we could wave a wand and just make it better. How would that look?
That's a tough question because, I was having this conversation with someone from No Olympics LA, like the No Olympics organizing chapter in Los Angeles, which the No Olympics movement is international. It's quite incredible, right? And the thing is like it starts with land, and there are valid questions around like, can you have an ethical international sporting event because of the level of securitization and land use and removal of people forcibly from their land, right, that it requires for these things to happen. Like I sort of disagree with their point. My sense is you could, right? People have, I'm trying to forget, I forget the author, but someone suggested sort of floating infrastructure, so building temporary stadiums that could be prefab built and then torn down. There's also an idea of like a permanent city for the Olympics, right? Say Bern for the Winter Olympics and Athens for the Summer Games, right? And you just keep them in one place, and then that becomes like sort of a sporting mecca. The issue there is that eventually all infrastructure needs to be replaced, especially stadiums, which see high use, high wear, and with that many people coming in over and over again. Or just sort of decentralize the Olympics and, host different events in different places, right? But also that sort of denies the idea of like everyone coming together under one roof, which is one of the things like that gives people such the good feelings about the Olympics, right? Those are the vibes.
Yeah, I mean, they're doing that for the 2026 World Cup in like North America for soccer, aren't they? Something like that. It's going to be in a bunch of cities.
They are. It's Mexico, Canada, and the US all together. I think that one's a little, I would say that one's a little different because like basically what it really is it's an economic ploy to, especially for Canada and the US, right, to just drive people to soccer because there is like a growing soccer market in America, and this hypothetically should be the flashpoint for soccer blowing up there. And it's one of those things where it's like, oh, it made sense because you got soccer crazy people in Mexico, you have the US, and then you have Canada, which actually has some really rock solid soccer infrastructure. So it's like, oh no, we can do this, and the US is like a hugely untapped market for soccer, even despite its growing popularity. So, they really want that to be like the next level for FIFA, because you can't argue with that purchasing power, right?
Okay, so it's decentralized, but for the wrong reasons.
Yeah,
Okay.
I would say don't expect this every time.
we can bring you back for a FIFA episode when that comes up because I want to talk about them too.
Oh yeah, FIFA is like a soap opera, is like an evil soap opera that never ends.
All right, I don't think we've talked so far about the environmental impact of the Olympics. I'm curious about sort of, I assume it has something to do with the land use, but could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, like the Olympics is effectively a tool for mass displacement and gentrification. Start to finish, the Olympics are one of the primary reasons for evictions, homelessness, destruction of neighborhoods, tearing up cities, like from police crackdowns in Rio to even things like, during the Vancouver Olympics, like cops went undercover into anti-Olympics movements and helped provoke, like, and act as provocateurs during protests and stuff like that. The like crackdown on unhoused people during the Vancouver Games was horrific, like to say the least. And the Olympic Village, which was supposed to be turned into low-income housing.
Oh, it is not. I can tell you right now.
Not, yeah.
It is. I live Olympic Village adjacent, and it is maybe one of the most expensive places to live in Vancouver.
Yeah. Only one building remains that was low income housing, and don't quote me on this, it may have been turned into a brewery.
That would be
I don't classic
know.
Vancouver, yeah.
That does sound like Vancouver. There's a lot of breweries in this neighborhood.
Yeah, so it's like right there you've got that. Then you've got the environmental impact of actually building these stadiums, right? Which, by the way, do not get used after they've been built. Like, it's very rare that you see an Olympic stadium being used. I know, like, Korea did it a little better because they sort of turned their stadiums by and large, not comprehensively, but by and large into a sort of like athlete training area. But like even for the Tokyo Games, right? A lot of their construction is now like really not being used. In Brazil, like it's almost post-apocalyptic when you see how they built different stadiums for different sporting events. They're now just being reclaimed by jungle. Same thing with like Sochi in Russia. I don't know. I don't know what's happened to the last Beijing facilities. I haven't looked at that, but I haven't like I think that again it goes back to my point, right? Like comprehensively, no matter who's hosting the Olympics, they're going to be a disaster. But the fact that I haven't seen much fanfare around the way the Beijing facilities are means that whatever specific xenophobia the Canadian government or media is trying to provoke can't get them on that.
Mm.
I'm fully in favor of an Olympics boycott, right? It's just like the methodology in which it's being deployed right now is discomforting to say the least, because it's focusing on and there are very valid things to be said about China's human rights record. Don't get me wrong, but in regards to the Olympics specifically, it's being used as a political weapon against China and not as a argument for Olympic abolition altogether, right? Like the human cost of the Beijing Olympics is the same as the human cost of any other games. I think that that's something that really needs to be set straight about the Olympics is no country can host an ethical Olympics and all of them have basically the same outcome for the people who are most vulnerable in those cities, in those countries that they're being hosted in, right? That's money diverted from public service, that's money diverted from municipal improvement. The like line they built in Rio, transit line they built in Rio is like awful, because it basically connects rich neighborhoods to rich neighborhoods, nothing else. In fact, it continues to it like split off the poor parts of the city from everywhere else. So it's stuff like that where it's like, like Beijing Olympics completely unethical, but the overall sort of crux of the Olympics is they should not happen here. Like the same fanfare we're seeing around boycotting Beijing should happen for every other game.
Gotcha. So there's like that bucket of harms that are related to basically any Olympics that's being held. And then there's also the sort of additional like concentration camps, aspect to the Chinese games. That makes sense.
Yeah, there's everything else, right? And it's like very specifically the games themselves just they need to be boycotted in totality, right? And it's like it's a cudgel for this like sort of ongoing anti-China sentiment that's emerging, right? A lot of which is valid, but I think a lot of it is also perpetuated by warhawks who are looking for an excuse or a boogeyman. You know what I mean? Like it goes back to this fact that like the largest companies in the world, like Nike, right? Speaking of the Olympics, has started moving its manufacturing facilities to places like Bangladesh and Taiwan, where because there's sort of like a less oversight, and countries there, like it's a different form of slave labor.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's sort of the stuff that I'm just like it's tough. And like it's tough. No, there are no good guys in this situation.
Yeah, do you think the problem is just like this mixture of like sports as entertainment with sports as geopolitics that the Olympics brings?
Yeah, like sports are and always have been, a politically motivated event, right? They're a mega event. They're one of the few mega events that still happens. Like really, what else is there that has the same? Like we don't have World's Fairs anymore. You know what I mean?
That's true. Thought about that in a while.
Yeah, but it's like that's sort of exactly it. Like there is obviously like a political agenda attached to games and how people react to the games. There's a reason that like there's so much, there's a reason that like, the Munich games happened the way they did, right? Because everyone knew the eyes of the world would be there. Like if the Russia Olympics were being held today, I think the sentiment around them would be a lot different than it was when they did happen, even then, like there was a lot of, I would argue, hypocritical criticism levied at Russia in the context of like, Western powers, extraordinary overreach over global politics and global economics and like just the human life, right, and exploitation. You're seeing a very similar thing happen with China. There's a lot of pot calling the kettle black here and things like that, and there's a lot of like willful ignorance towards the human cost of things like the games in Rio and the games in Sochi and even places like Pyeongchang, and also the sponsorships, right? Like the Olympics' biggest sponsor is Coca-Cola, which used to run death squads to murder union organizers, with the complete if not endorsement, but just the blind eye of international governments and things like that. Like I'm just pulling up the Olympic sponsors list right now. Yeah, it's like a real axis of evil as far as like corporations go, right? Like Dow Chemical, Coca-Cola, Bridgestone, Visa, and stuff like that, right? Alibaba Group, which is I think they're one of the most valuable corporations in the world at this point, and stuff like that. So it's like, yeah, like those are the like top sponsors. Those are the real top line sponsors. And it's like, oh yeah, this is just evil at every fucking level, right?
It's just evil all the way down.
Yeah, I didn't realize. I'm just looking now. The Airbnb was just added as a sponsor as well, alongside Procter and Gamble.
Oh,
Oh,
Procter and
no.
Gamble.
Are there any sponsors on there that are not the epitome of evil?
See, like there is and there isn't, because like you can make an argument that Intel, Samsung, and Panasonic aren't, but also like I'm pretty sure Intel does like a lot of like security and defense contracting, right? Samsung effectively has a stranglehold on the South Korean government because they bring in around 4% of that country's GDP.
Well, and we just did a whole episode on conflict minerals and how the entire tech industry is kind of it's hard to get out of them. It's not like entirely the tech industry's fault, but it's also like entirely the tech industry's fault. So
Yeah, and the way the global, so like the easy way to attack the environmental impact of the Olympics is like people fly there, but that's such a silly non-issue in terms of its environmental impact compared to who it's rehabilitating, what it's trying to sell, how it's trying to sell it. Like there's the rags to riches story and the feel good stories of all these athletes, and don't get me wrong, I am not clean of crying during a good figure skating match, right? Like, I was watching the fucking 3 overtime Raptors game yesterday, and I was literally crying when my favorite player hit a three, because I knew the story. Yeah, that's part of why we like sports. Is you don't love it because you're watching superhumans excel. Like that's part of it, but you're watching it because the narrative they craft is so beautiful and effective.
Yeah, I'm a Habs fan. Their playoff cup run was an incredible narrative last year.
Yeah, someone who grew up with the Leafs, I had the opposite.
That's fair. That's fair. That was rough.
Yeah, it was very rough. I jumped back on the bandwagon because I'd given up on them, thinking like the league effectively made it so that they had to make the finals that year, and no, they did not. But yeah, that's sort of it, right? And these companies know exactly what they're doing when they sponsor the Olympics, when they sponsor athletes, when they, like the internet. I used to work in advertising, never an Olympics campaign, unfortunately, although that would have been wicked to have an unlimited budget. But like, like there's a reason Coca-Cola is putting out like these documentaries about athletes that are so inspirational and so nice, and how Coca-Cola, that don't even mention Coca-Cola at all. You know what I mean? Like, just at the end is like a little card or something like that, right? Or there's some charitable initiative that they succeeded from that Coca-Cola helped sponsor or something like that. So yeah, it's like, that's a big part of it as well. Like Airbnb seeks to profit immensely from the games, especially in the fallout from the pandemic, right? Where people are traveling more and things like that. And that's another layer to the ongoing displacement that Airbnb and the Olympics were already complicit in. Now they're colliding in like the worst possible way. How many people remember waving flag and remember that it was attached to was it the Olympics or was it the World Cup? I can't even remember at this point. I'm pretty sure it was the World Cup. But like, waving flag, which Coca-Cola licensed, right? And everyone associates I'm happy K9 got the bag, but like everybody associates that with with Coca-Cola, right?
It's a
And
great song,
associate
though.
that song. Yeah. Oh, it
Yeah.
absolutely is. No, don't get me wrong. He has not really released music since that song came out, and I'm 100% sure he's just living off the royalties of that song. It's like, good for you, man. Like, there's a narrative right there, right? You grew up in Somalia, refugee, come to Canada, and next thing you know, your songs being used by Coca-Cola, recorded in 100 different languages around the world, right? And everyone for the rest of their lives will be able to hum the chorus, right? And it's like that's like real power right there, and everyone will think Coca-Cola. It's funny, the two most recognized words in the English language globally are the words okay and Coke, right?
Cool. What a nice world we live in.
Yeah, it's so frustrating because what you just told us was like, it's actually an amazing story, and there's so many really beautiful stories that come out of the Olympics. And so it's so frustrating that it's built on this rotten foundation.
But I feel like it's also like propaganda so often. Like there's that new Netflix docu-series called Bad Sport.
Oh, that's great. Bad Sport is terrific.
It's so good. The racing episode was so good. But we were watching the Olympic figure skating, like Jamie Salé, David Peltier situation, and I forgot how like anti-Russia and like white picket fences 1950s Americana that whole story was. Like, that's wild. I don't know.
And we also don't see the human cost of the athletes that were left behind, right? Because like your odds of making it in any professional sport are it's effectively a lottery in some sports like the NFL and the NBA. Your odds are actually less than winning the lottery to go pro. Because there's only 286 active NBA players in any given time or something like that, right? Like, but you have people who are training their entire lives to go to the Olympics. This is literally all they can do, right? Like it's what you've been brought up to as a child. Like sometimes in a lot of sports, especially the bigger ones, there are like elite prep schools and colleges that start at like the grade level, that simply develop your basketball skills and stuff like that. And then the outcome of that is that your body is wrecked by the time you're like 30. But also this is what you've been bred in a lab to do, and because you're 0.02 seconds behind the next guy, you've blown your chance.
That reminds me of the Hunger Games, where like
Yeah.
the first like 3 districts that just raise their kids to go to the games and murder each other, and it's like
Oh man. Yeah, you're not wrong.
Yeah, it's 100% correct. And that's sort of the stuff where it's like, oh yeah, that's really fucked up, because for all the athletes you see at the games, there's like at least 100 athletes who were right on the cusp, right? But again, like the difference between the highest level in any sport and the next highest level is really like measured in milliseconds. In the NBA, it's like measured in, are you a quarter step too slow? Because if you are, you don't belong here, and stuff like that, right? It's like, oh yeah, like that is effectively chance at a certain point on top of like a lifetime of training. It's that last little hurdle, and it's like, yeah, like once you're there, there's mental health crises up and down the world of sport. There's health crises up and down the world of sport. There's also like most Olympians have to bankroll their own way there, right? Most Olympians don't get the sponsorship. Most Olympians don't get money from their government to go. Most Olympian, like I'm sure if you go like Olympic GoFundMe, I'll actually Google this right now. Like this was something my friend Jules Boykoff, who wrote a great book called No Olympians, right? Where it's an ethnographic study of no Olympics movements across the world. He wrote extensively on this stuff, and that's one of the things he brought up is like if you Google Olympic GoFundMe, you'll see hundreds, because that's the only way they can get to the games. And the first thing that comes up when you Google Olympic GoFundMe, support Canadian Olympic athlete Kevin Hill in 2022, Ryan's Olympic journey and beyond. Some of these are as recent as 5 days ago. Fundraiser by Cross Country BC, Remy Drolet's Olympic year. Right, this is the only way they're able to make it. It's an expensive thing to train 365 days a year, and if you're not rich, and in Canada, like especially in the Winter Olympics, a lot of these guys are. It's just how the chips fall for a lot of winter sports. But, especially for the summer games and things like that, like, yeah, people don't have the economic upbringing or class background that allows them to go to the Olympics, right? And they have to do stuff like this, and that's their dream, and they likely won't succeed at achieving that dream, if not for financial reasons, again, because you're a second too slow, right?
Yeah, those stories are like the underdog stories are always amazing when they succeed, but for every one success story, there's thousands of people who sunk their life and effort and all their dollars into trying to go and didn't succeed.
Well, that's okay. They can all just go play college sports. I hear those pay really well.
Yeah, if you're a coach. The Auburn football coach just re-upped for $50 million.
Oh
The players, of course, do not get paid.
See, this is why I like silly sports, like for every person who's been born, bred, and trained in like some of the higher paid ones, there's also like the curlers who like have beer bellies. Although they are kind of getting to be a bigger sport now, so there's less of that. But
curling may strangely be one of the more ethical sports out there. It's funny because swimming is like swimming from water polo to, distance swimming to speed swimming, like that is a hotbed of shit, actually. The list of FINA controversies is like 7 feet tall.
Yikes. Yeah, I'm trying to think of other underwater hockey. That's probably fine. I don't know. Maybe it's tied to swimming.
Yeah, it's not an Olympic sport. I don't know if it's a federation, but it's not an Olympic sport. So there's that, right? It already has one up on everything else.
So Abdul, as a fan of sports, I feel like we've just spent 40 minutes shitting on sports. What, like, after all of that, knowing everything that you know, especially as an expert in this, what draws you to watch the Olympics anyways? Like, why do you still collect 350 sneakers?
I mean, the sneaker thing is its own thing. If you ever want to do an episode on simple luxury being commodified into asset classes, I am your guy. That is 100% my fucking wheelhouse, right? Like, because sneakers technically should cost $150, but they're because people can't afford stocks now, turn them into basically assets, right? Like proto NFTs. I am ashamed to say, I've spent up to like $2,000-3,000 on pairs, right? Like that should have been that retailed for like 150 and things like that. Not anymore now that I'm quit my job to write full time, but like, that's its own separate like world, right? But it's like, I'm drawn to sport because I'm very interested in the idea of what sports could be and also what they represent, and especially the individual narratives, right? Like there is something really compelling about watching people who are quite literally the best in the world at what they do and how they got there, and the spectacle of like human achievement, whether or not it's kayfabe, right? Like whether or not that's actually a realistic thing in the context of like, rampant PED use, among other things. Like it can be really beautiful, right? It can be really beautiful for the people who make it there, and it can be really incredible to see the stories that emerge from it and stuff like that. Like I've always likened sports as a whole to, sort of like an anime. Like sure, you can turn on a random game of basketball if you don't watch basketball, and you can get engaged with it, right? But like for someone who like regularly watches a team or like follows the league, like they have the NBA subreddit set as their homepage, like I mean, like you're engaged because the narratives, the rivalries, the stories, the placement of the players, like the placement of where the team is on the standings, what they need to do to get there, and what they need to lose, right? Like, or how they can lose and stuff like that. Like the stakes and the emotional impact of it is it's gorgeous storytelling. And that's really what the Olympics succeeds at, and that's one of the reasons it's so successful, is because it's able to like craft such hundreds, if not thousands, of incredible narratives year after year. And it's also one of the reasons that like alternative to the Olympics isn't feasible, because an alternative to the Olympics is ultimately an ethical choice, but no one has been able to create or actualize an alternative that plays into the sort of narrative of sport in a way that is equally compelling, right? I also think that's one of the reasons, like the Soviet Olympiad, like the Workers' Olympiad, didn't work, because the Olympics, as I'm not saying there isn't like competition under socialism, like, to friendly competition to see who's the best at something. That's a fact. Of course there will be. Everyone wants to be better than someone else in terms of their achievement. That's not a bad thing, right? But like, in a lot of ways, like those narratives actually hinge on the exploitation that comes with the sport, right? Because they managed to succeed in spite of those, in spite of the cruelty, and in spite of the exploitation, in spite of the ways that like capitalism hinders people. And that is really fascinating to me. Like, it's almost like an understood part, is that the reason these people are here is because they were better than the system that held them back, and here's why. And now they're competing against each other, and one guy got 1 extra inch after failing his first 2 attempts in the high jump. He got 1 extra inch, and he managed to just sneak out the gold. Or like, I remember one of my favorite from the Vancouver Olympics was like the bartender who won silver in bobsled, right? And for Canada and things like that. It's like, no, it's wicked. Like, he just jumped off his bobsled and crushed 2 beers. You know what I mean? It's like, yeah, that's awesome. Or stuff like that. It's really engaging. I think it speaks to something very primal for us as people, right? Like the need to like both respect a degree of like perseverance and work ethic and skill on top of just relate to like really excellent stories that are real, right? Or they give off the appearance of being real.
Yeah. And then I feel like every sport has its own culture too, which I like. Like the snowboarder is very different.
Yeah, just absolute fuckboy. Like every trip to Banff is is an experience for when you live in Alberta. That's also a big part of it, right? Is like the reason college sports are such a hegemony and stuff like that is because, and the reason they're such a vehicle for like reactionary politics is because I mean, this is sort of my theory on it. I've written not extensively, but enough about it, right? Is that college sports, especially in small towns, like Missoula and stuff like that, or other places, like they effectively replaced the economic devastation led by capital flight, right? Like you're no longer proud of the fact that there was a manufacturing industry here and that was like a committed identity, right? Like post-war, like everyone's come together to support the national good by producing this many widgets and stuff like that. It's the pride disappeared when capital left and was replaced by fentanyl and poverty. And college sports are one of the few ways that people actually find that sort of like shared community. And then you just keep ramping that up, because then it goes municipal, right? Toronto Raptors, any city hockey team or a sports team. And then it goes national, right? Like the Canada, I'm not really a big fan of Canada for obvious reasons, but like today at 1:05 or today in 2 hours I will be watching the Canada USA World Cup qualifiers, right? I'll have that on one screen. On my laptop I'll have the Bengals game. It's like, and why am I cheering for Cincinnati? It's because this is a first time they've made the playoffs in 30 years. And they've won 2 games, and seeing the like happiness of the people of Cincinnati after suffering for 30 years of just being a nothing team, right, is beautiful. Like that's a great underdog story. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. Yeah, I lived in Toronto for about 7 years, and part of that was during the Raptors run, and it was just like, yeah, I don't even watch basketball, but this is a great story. Everybody gets their moment with a good narrative.
And that's sort of it, right? Like that Raptors narrative is fantastic, because the leader of the Raptors, they traded away his best friend to bring in this other guy who didn't want to be here, but then like committed to the vision after coming back from a year of injury. They traded for a dude who his brother, he was traded for his brother when he was drafted, and his brother went on to win championships while Mark was just like wasting away in Memphis, right? And then he got a call from his coach being like, we're going to trade you to the Raptors, go win a championship. And it's like, that's amazing. That's so sweet, right? And it's like, it's those stories that you're just like, oh yeah, that really like catches your heartstrings, right? And it's like, it's hard to argue with the way that like you really felt like you were part of something, when everyone was watching the games. Like even in Edmonton, which unfortunately is where I was when they won the championship. They like I remember hearing fucking honking outside my suburban apartment. Like I could actually hear people cheering, and I lived in like the deep suburbs when they won the final buzzer run, right? It's just like, oh, this is unbelievable, right? Like I thought I was Edmonton's only basketball fan up until that point.
It's pretty incredible how it can draw. Like that's what's really cool about the Olympics is how everybody in the world who's watching this is watching at the same time and cheering together. So like that part of it is really really cool. And I also like as somebody who's not a sports person at all, I see a lot of opportunity for community for men there that just they have a hard time finding other places because of lots of reasons, mostly toxic masculinity. But like I and it's just such a shame that I don't know, like not to change the subject entirely, but that so many leagues, especially like in big sports, have such a problem with misogyny. And it's just like I don't know, it could be such a beautiful thing, like a bunch of dudes touching each other's butts on the field. Like let's like go for it, guys.
And it's nice to see like, there is a new wave of like sports media and sports journalism that is like centering women's sport as well. And like the WNBA did a really smart thing by making their like all access league pass $25 a year, right? Which is
That's
like
awesome. Yeah.
nothing. Like I subscribe to it. I don't watch as many games as I should. I will when Toronto gets a team. But like that's great. Like just by putting in that $25, it's like at least I'm like through the lens of capitalism, like validating this as something that should make money. You know what I mean? Like
Yes.
and like yeah, like so yeah, like I write for television now, thankfully, but like I spent my 20s working at a labor union, right? And the two things I could always connect with workers on, especially workers I had never met before, were sports and smoking, right? It's like either if they weren't a smoker, you bet there was a sport they liked, and you bet, I made it my goal to know everything about the major leagues that were going on at the time, specifically so I could have a conversation and stuff like that, right? And it's like the sports is such an excellent vehicle for organizing, for pushing ideas of like labor, for demonstrating the sort of inherent contradictions and cruelty of capitalism, right? And it's like I find this isn't a fresh take by any means. This is a very boring take, but I find that like a lot of leftists, maybe just the terminally online ones, often like put away sports as like bread and circuses, right? Or like a purely male operated project and stuff like that. I
Oh,
think a lot of it,
guilty. You've
yeah,
called me out.
I think a lot of it is that like a lot of the environment of sports culture isn't comfortable for female sports fans. I will say that. Like, I think there's a lot more than you might think. It's just not expressed quite as often. But also, just like they're a great way to open up conversations about things, right? Like the most visible wildcat strike in North America since before Reagan was a sports strike, and that like the linchpin of the current culture war started with Colin Kaepernick. Those things are so crucial when you think about the sort of the way that sports captures the eye of the world. Like no one took COVID seriously until the big four leagues shut down. Like I remember I was in Banff for a work thing, and I was going to fly on the following Monday to Toronto. Oh no, I was going to fly the next day to Toronto on the Friday, and on Monday I was going to take my dad to his first Raptors game, which was the first time the Raptors were playing the Warriors again after the finals run, right? And I was just like at the bar, and I ran into a friend. I'm just like, yeah, I'm leaving tomorrow. I'll go watch the game on Monday. He's like, oh, you didn't hear? Like it's canceled. And I'm like, the game? No, he's like, the league. And I like Googled it, and I'm like, holy shit. And then I remember I drove up to Banff 2 days earlier, and I drove back the next day, and it was like the entire tenor of the world. It was a 5-hour drive, and the entire tenor of the world had changed. And it was specifically because all the leagues had at that point had by then announced they were shutting down.
Yeah, I was in the middle of a move, and my dad was with me helping me. And we had stopped into like a sports bar because we had just driven my stuff like 5 hour drive, and we're like, we had no other place to get food. So we're in this sports bar, and like it was coming just as the announcement. So like all the leagues were canceling that day when pretty much everybody decided to cancel sports. And I was like, that was when it really felt serious for me. It was like, shit, sports stopped for nothing. Like,
Yeah, that's exactly it. And it's like it's very telling, right? Like that is an incredible way. Like sports are an incredible marker of like where the culture is at, and they also turn an incredible eye to issues that would otherwise be unable to be talked about, or that like largely capitalist status quo media will not talk about, right? But because sports are such a huge cultural totem, like of course they're going to be obligated to talk about it, and the way they talk about it oftentimes fans disagree with, right? And things like that, like and that's like specific athletes boycotting the Olympics, right? Like this huge issues around like issues for trans people, right? And like just passive transphobia were really brought into the spotlight due to athletics and the way the world of athletics views like trans women and things like that. And very effective at like communicating like, no, but still in like a very racist transphobic world, right? And it's that sort of stuff that's like, oh yeah, no, like organizing sports is a great vehicle for organizing and talking about things, because it's so compelling. But also be like, more people watch sports than don't watch sports, and it's that means that it's a valuable thing that people aren't talking about. If you don't do it, someone else will, right?
Yeah, it's really frustrating for fans, I know. I mean, it's not just the Olympics, it's everywhere. Like, if you look at who owns all of the major football leagues in Europe, it's like Saudi princes and oil conglomerates and whatever. So, like, it sucks that something so that's so big and that could be that is often used for like good. It's just so frustrating for like I want more fan-owned leagues. Can we have that? Can we have more fan-owned leagues?
It actually happened in the worst way possible. There's a Twitch. There's a Twitch league called football league called Fan Controlled Soccer, where you pay a membership and you get to like vote on plays and lineups and a bunch of other stuff like moment to moment. And it's sort of horrific. Like that's the stuff where I'm like, because there's also like the argument, like like the plantation system of college sports, right? But then also like when you sort of, and I understand the coach, sort of the managerial coach player relationship, when you give control of people's bodies to something like that, it makes me feel icky. You know what I mean? Like it's so weird. So it's like there can be fan owned leagues, unfortunately, not like this. And and there's like, like it's funny because in Europe there's a pervasive sense that the big four American leagues are socialist, right? Because they have like profit sharing agreements to prop up the small market teams, and the way that their like trade system works and things like that is effectively there to create equity. Whereas like the transfer system of Premier League soccer and things like that is very, very different. And it's very funny. It's very funny to think of the fact that like they're not wrong, right? But it is like very much like socialism for the rich. But
Yeah. The NHL is unionized, but
yeah, yeah. Oh, don't get me started on players' unions. But yeah, like, but yeah, I think there is some sort of motive for like there is a way to do like a proper a fan-owned league that's not like the thing you always hear is the Green Bay Packers, but that's more of like a joke. It's a certificate you own, right? Like certain teams are municipally owned. In Canada, I think a couple of CFL teams are. I'm pretty sure the Edmonton Elks are a public-private partnership, and I'm don't quote me. Either the Rough Riders or the Blue Bombers are technically civically owned through some sort of public system. But yeah, like I'm a big proponent of public ownership of sports teams. Maybe not fan ownership, but like I really do think they should be treated as like a municipal service, because that gives you a lot more power over the ways that you can craft good urban spaces and good municipal power through sport, right? Like it's ways to incorporate things like stadiums into cities without them being like a gentrifying or dispossessing force, or the ways that you can increase access to it, or the ways that you can use that to draw more more people in and sort of create positive economic conditions for the people in the city, right? Like if sports teams exist to generate profit, right? Like even with $109 million salary cap, the Raptors are still one of the most profitable teams in the league. And it's like, no, actually that profit just went back into municipal. That's a great trade-off. Like you spent 300 million operating revenue, and if you get 400 million back, right? Like you've just added $100 million to cities' coffers, and that's fucking incredible, right? Like, and the thing is like it's not a brave thing for cities to do because the immense cost of buying in is so high. And it's deliberately designed so things can't happen. But I genuinely think that's something that should be considered as part of municipal works projects and civic projects, because the cost return is extraordinary.
Yeah, I'm agreeing with all of what you're saying, but I'm also thinking in the back of my head, like how stupid municipal politics would be if like the Oilers were owned by the government. It would constantly be about like who the general manager was and whether like the mayor should fire the coach or whatever. But...
Yeah, just treat it like a separate, or just the federal government should just buy Maple Leaf Sports and Entertainment and treat it as like an arm's length crown corporation. You know what I mean? Like,
there you go. Yeah.
Yeah, like that. Like you manage yourself, whatever stupid pay raises you need, but as long as you're generating a profit, you're good,
Yeah.
right? Like, and it can't be like, it's not like any other federally owned services, because again, sports teams turn a profit. Like that is a hard fact. You know what I mean? It's as opposed to, oh, Air Canada's not profitable right now and we're spending more than we're putting in, where it's like, let's make it a private corporation. It's like that will never happen unless they hire the worst general manager and tank for 20 years. That will never happen to the Raptors. Even in their worst days, they were minting money.
So is that the best solution for sports? Just make them all publicly owned?
I think for individual teams, yeah. I personally, I think sports should be like, especially teams. Like, I don't know what the solution for international sports are, because it's so tough, right? Like, it requires such a groundswell of change, and obviously, like when you're looking at 150 different countries, the circumstances of what that looks like might change as well, right? Especially since a lot of Olympic sports just aren't profitable outside of the Olympics. Like over 4 years, like no one's turning money, and they expect whoever does invest is expecting to at least break even or make that back when the Olympics happen. But I think there is like an interesting conversation to be had about public ownership of sports leagues, things like, specific teams and stuff like that, like a genuine move to that. I don't know if Oklahoma City, for example, can pony up the 1.5 billion required to buy the Thunder.
There's just a staggering amount of money in sports.
It's interesting because, like, what is the biggest signifier of wealth in America? It's not going to space. It's owning a fucking sports team, right? Like, you can be the richest person in the world, but the club of people who own sports teams is so small and so exclusive, and you need to be voted in when you make a bid to buy. Like, the other guys need to let you into that club. Like, no one knew who Steve Ballmer was when he was the CEO of Microsoft, right? But everyone knows him as the guy who's allegedly coked up on the sidelines of every Clippers game, and how he paid like $2.5 billion for that team, right? Now it's like, it really is like one of those things where it's like, the real vision of success. That's also why like a lot of sort of immigrant billionaires buy sports teams as well, because that is the real, like, you've made it type of a American dream moment. There's so many billionaires in the world, unfortunately, and aside from like, the Elon Musk thing, it's like the ones most about probably are the guys who own teams.
Could we not start like a guerrilla movement where like the city of Vancouver just starts a team and puts them in the NHL?
So it costs, I think the cost that you need to give to the NHL simply to optioned the idea of starting a team is 500 million.
Oh, okay.
Good start with women's hockey, though.
But then, like, because it's harder for women's sports to turn a profit, right? How
That's
long
true.
does it take and stuff like that? So it's like, it's really, you're just trapped in this very like interesting system. There are a couple of publicly owned soccer teams, but that has a much different cultural tradition than and historical tradition than like sports in North America, right? I'm just looking up a list of publicly owned sports companies. Are there any in Canada? Okay, Valor FC in Winnipeg, Victoria Highlanders FC. These are fan owned. Sorry, these are fan owned sports teams. Here are the public sports teams. No, those are publicly traded. Oh yeah, they're also not mostly publicly traded. So like that's how exclusive the club is that they are sports are by and large specifically for the board of directors and like the owner. There's been some writing on like why cities should buy sports teams and things like that. The thing is like if you're already in a debt crisis, the break even point is 10 years ahead. But once you get to that 10 years, you're rolling, right? But it's like just the upfront cost. Like how much did Steve Ballmer pay for the Clippers? It was like 2.5 billion, right?
Oh my gosh.
And they're a shit team too, but he bought it from Donald Sterling, right? The racist landlord billionaire whose explicit reason for buying this team and not really caring about the fact they owned this team for however long he had it was because he just wanted to own a team. Same thing. That's why Donald Trump kept investing in like minor football leagues, right? Because he wanted to buy an NFL team and they wouldn't let him into the club. And that's really it. You know what I mean? Like that's really the like, and it extends to every part of the sporting world, but especially teams. Like that's a huge part of it.
Yeah, I'm curious about like because governments pour a bunch of money into sports, and I'm curious for your thoughts on what they should be spending that money on. Like, should it be sports but just done differently, or what do you think? Just buying up local leagues?
I think support for local leagues, minor leagues, like like minor leagues already have such extreme labor disparities and their margins probably aren't as thin as they say they are. But like, I mean, like that's an interesting thing because the cost to operate is, I think, low enough to justify it. I think public-private partnerships or just publicly paid for sports stadiums are obviously the wrong idea. I don't actually think privately built stadiums are a necessarily bad thing. They don't really cause an employment jump or an average wage increase around that. In fact, it's funny. Many sports teams will average out the pay of in their proposition. I know Calgary definitely did this when they were talking about the average pay of workers in their new stadium, which may or may not be built at this point. I think it's a big no right now. They averaged in terms of salaries. They put in player salaries to up the average of workers of how this would affect worker pay, which is hilarious, right? Because like that jump, if you have 1,000 people who are making like $15 an hour and like 6 people who are making 10 million, right? The average jumps to like $14 an hour or $25 an hour or something like that, right? Like it's a pretty statistically significant, even though the numbers are so out of skew. It's hilariously and like almost cartoonishly underhanded. Yeah, privately owned stadiums. I think that municipalities should flex a much larger degree of control over where those stadiums go, and I think that there should be an expectation from municipal governments to say that like if you want to play here, if you want to keep turning money, you better give us some, or at the very least invest in a certain number of like separate publicly accountable community projects, right? And things like that. And a lot of teams do this through their charitable end, right? Like MLSE Foundation or the Edmonton Oilers Community Foundation or whatever, right? But like, no, don't make that PR thing. Take more money from them and force them in. And if they want to up and demand and move the team, you know what I mean? Like other municipalities can't say no.
Yeah, I think Daryl Cates was like trying to put the Oilers charitable, like the foundation's donations into his like arena bid when they were looking at building the stadium. And it's like they basically just buy up Oilers tickets and give it to people. Like
Yeah, like that's why you'll see in most games like the lower bowls are empty is because those are all corporate tickets that no one went to and stuff like that. But it's like, yeah, it's things like that that are sort of crucial, you know, like there's a not insignificant chance the Calgary Flames will move to Texas, right? Or some other city if this arena is not built, which it's looking like it will not be built now because they wanted the government to throw in an additional 5%, and finally the municipal government said fuck you, which is the best thing because they're already paying for I think 49 or 51, it was like something like that. And the cost ballooned and they asked for more money and the money said no, and the ownership is now probably going to move the team, hopefully. There can only be one in Alberta. But yeah, like, you know, it's stuff like that where it's like when you look at like Oakland, for example, like the Raiders were a religion in Oakland, and when they upped and moved to Vegas in what I believe was the most expensive stadium ever built on American soil, it is. If you haven't seen it, it's incredible. If you just Google Raider Stadium, you'll see it is like Allegiant Stadium. It's called. It is like, yeah, it is a wonder of the world as far as I'm concerned. Like, more like when they polled people about whether or not Oakland should build a new stadium to keep the Raiders or whatever, people said no. You know what I mean? Like people saw through that and they're like, we love the Raiders, but that's public money. You know what I mean? Like absolutely not, right? In a city like Oakland, which suffers such an extreme class divide, like of course, people were going to be like, this is not tenable and this is not something we want. And this is not like this is manipulative. And you know, I feel betrayed by the team for a number of reasons, not the players, but the people who own it. They understand that and they don't forget that, right? So it's like, yeah, like, you know, if the Flames threaten to pack up, you know, it sucks. Like, so be it. You know what I mean? But then, like, something else hopefully comes in, fills the void, and is like privately funded, and someone else sees the or the city of Calgary just decides we're going to own a fucking sports team, right? But yeah, like it's funny because in the States, like Allegiant Stadium is probably going to be one of the last purely publicly funded stadiums in the United States. And Allegiant did it a little differently because they actually levied a hotel tax in Vegas specifically to pay for the stadium. I think it's a $10 fee attached to every hotel ticket. Yeah, like that part is super interesting. Like the way Vegas paid for the stadium, I find intriguing because they know the cost benefit. I mean, Vegas is a very specific city. This isn't applicable to literally any other city, but like it stands to reason that Vegas will get more from paying for that stadium than what they eventually put in, right? Just because of the way that city runs. But the trend towards publicly financed stadiums in the US is actually dropping sharply, and they're capitalist sustainability is bullshit, but they're also being built a bit more sustainably now, right? And they're built to last a bit longer. But in Canada that trend has not changed at all, which I find upsetting. You know what I mean? Like we're just two steps behind that sort of stuff, and it's like it's tough to look at, like, for example, like Rogers Place in Edmonton, which was, it's like a UFO got dropped in the middle of downtown. I've been there a bunch of times and it's a spectacular stadium, right? But like back in the before times, like I was doing a photojournalism thing, like I was doing ride-alongs with like crisis intervention teams at Boyle Street Community Services and stuff like that, and it's like it's very interesting to see, one, not gonna say he was underpaid, but one person who should have been getting paid a lot more for like the stuff he was doing, loading clean needles into the back of a white van so we could drive around for hours, just handing them out to people who needed them, right? Like right behind him, there's this like enormous stadium, right? And it's like, oh, like that is incredibly fucked up. Like, the amount of people, of unhoused people that were displaced, and the amount of like not even good, not that gentrification is good, but not even like effective gentrification, because the ice district, which was the whole stadium development that's currently ongoing, right? Like, I'm sorry, no one wants to live in fucking Edmonton. There's no pride in saying you live in the ice district of downtown Edmonton. You know what I mean? Like, you're not going to be Toronto. And they brought in like Richard Florida to consult, and he should be in The Hague, right? Like there's all sorts of other stuff around that development that's just like deeply upsetting, and it becomes worse when you consider the city just gave Daryl Cates like a blank check and said, go nuts and whatever, we'll bring in whoever you want, and these bullshit public consultations that mean nothing. It's just, yeah, it's very unfortunate. And like, you see a bigger version of that around the Olympics as well. And the way that like cities, because they're on the hook for the Olympics, right? You think about the cost of building one stadium. Now countries and cities are building 5 to 10 for what? Nothing.
I did want to ask Abdul how you feel about like own the podium funding by governments. Like, should governments be trying to win medals at the Olympics, or should they be just taking all of that money out and focusing on, like, I don't know, just having kids play games? you know?
I think it's tough because like it's hard to ignore the poverty of many athletes and stuff like that, even ones who win medals. Um, yeah, I think that's like a very complicated question, right? Because like most athletes, especially in North America and Western countries, don't get any support from their government, right? Like the support that was given historically was like a function of like Cold War, was a function of like of the Cold War, right? Of Cold War rivalry. Like there's a reason the Russian government basically, Soviet government basically created athletes in a lab because it was a way to flex on the world stage. That's why, the basketball dream team in the US happened, because they were tired of getting their asses kicked at basketball by the Soviets. And same thing with hockey, right? Everyone remembers the Miracle on Ice for a reason, because, they ended a decades long dominance of the Soviet hockey team. There's a great documentary on that called Red Army about like how the Soviets developed their players and like the labor, emotional and sort of economic outcomes of that. So it is really tough, right? Like I don't actually hate the idea of like international competition, but like the sort of labor questions around athletes need to be front and center. But then there's also a question of like, why not do both, right? Like why not build sustainable infrastructure and do municipal support, but also like make sure athletes can eat and that they're supported every step of their journey with like ongoing processes of like vetting and stuff like that. Like Cuba produced the best baseball players in the world, but those facilities were available to everyone. In fact, like, Cuba has a personal trainer for like every 12 people in the population, even during the sanctions and the famine in the 90s. That was a crucial part of the Cuban program, was to make sure athletics is considered a full part of like human development. And that is essential, I think, is like treating sports more holistically, having those sorts of government run institutions that are able to like vet the best of the best, right? And also support them, but also make sure that the people who can't make it don't fall on their feet. It's a job, right? Like it's a job and it's labor, and like labor should be supported. And when it comes to the Olympics, like athletes and anti-Olympics activists should be working hand in hand, but understandably, the tack that most anti-Olympics movements have taken is to start bottom up, which means that people in cities who are going to be displaced, right? And that's not an incorrect way to do it. And it's like, how do you take the next jump? No one really knows. It's very difficult.
We could start by ending billionaires. If there was no more billionaires to own the teams, the money wouldn't get so out of hand. It wouldn't be so hard for regular people to get on board with all of this.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, really is like a cash rules everything around me situation. Yeah, it's unfortunate, but like at the same time, with the Beijing Olympics, I think my biggest takeaway from that is that they're no means more or less ethical than any other Olympic games. Like the Olympics institutionally are just a failure, a staggering human failure, and a staggering point of global exploitation, right? That like seeps into every level of how we function as a global society. Which is like crazy to think about, right? Like that's what mega events by and large are. But I really do think, and again, this is where I break from the orthodox thoughts of many anti-Olympic people. They don't have to be this way. A lot of people see this as like, see it as like deterministic, and you can't really blame them that this is just inevitably going to happen as long as these sorts of mega events continue to be held. But I think there is a solution. I just think the solution is more difficult to reach somehow than abolishing the Olympics entirely.
Yeah, that's fair. So what should somebody listening to the podcast, what should they do to make sports more ethical, I guess, even if it's okay to watch the Olympics, because it's probably not going to change.
Um, that's a good question. I've never. It's actually a question I've never thought about. What can the average person do? I mean, really, it's like my go to would be like use the labor struggles of sports, like the MLB lockout is happening right now, right? As an avenue to open up conversations about unionizing your own workplace and build labor power, which uplifts all of us, right? Like everyone says athletes are overpaid, but my question is, they're actually underpaid for how much profit they generate, and like, why isn't everyone else getting paid more? Those are, I think sports is a great entryway into conversations. I think it's like worth doing what you can to support, even if it's just verbal, support things like player strikes, right? But yeah, big one is support people in your community for sure, but also like it's about developing relationships that allow you to access people and allow you to have difficult conversations about the way sports are currently organized. And it's tough because it's so like the distance between you and I on the shop floor and the people who are in the executive box of the arena is so enormous that it almost feels like nothing can change them. But the one thing sports have been really good at recently is kowtowing to public pressure. I hate to say like tweets work, but in this case, that might actually have been not a bad thing. That's sort of where I would say start. Like stop paying for minor league games; they're very exploitative. I know I'm a hypocrite with that, but like support community-owned teams if you can. And yeah, like really, it is through action, right? Like unionizing your own workplace, using sports as an entryway into having those conversations about labor are a big thing, because the good things about sports and especially about athlete power can really serve as an example for everyone. That affects athletes, and that affects the way we look at things like municipal spending, the way we look at like the way money sort of travels the globe in service of these events and who it serves and stuff like that. And also like sort of tying in, you can have interesting conversations about nationalism too, right? Like I do not love Canada, but again, I'm definitely cheering for that team. You know what I mean?
Yeah, fair. Yeah, and I guess also maybe supporting organizations like the Right to Play that help inclusion in sports could be a piece of the puzzle.
Yeah, for sure. Like supporting women's sports is really important as well. Like supporting marginalized people in sports. Like, it's interesting. The Paralympics always happen. Very few people watch them, but if you ever cancel them, there would be a public outcry, right? Organizations like Right to Play are very good, but like it's not just about the right to play; it's about the right to thrive. That is, I think, a big part of it is making sure that that people are supported at every step of their athletic journey, and that is also crucial. And that people have athletes have fallbacks and they have opportunities beyond simply playing. That is super super important. And yeah, like also like tapping into communities, right? Like the reason sports are great, you get an amazing community and you have something to root for, and that's crucial. And like it really is like a way to insert ideas, right? One of the reasons I think my writing, has been well received is I don't even think it's particularly good, but I think, I'm able or I was able to distill a lot of academic stuff that my friends who do sports academia have written about into stuff that a lot of people can be responsive to, right? Like I had a piece in Jacobin about the NBA's drug testing policy that a lot of people like messaged me about. Were like, hey, like this is something I never thought about, right? And this is something I never considered. And yeah, that was really fucked up.
Is that where you see your approach as a journalist, like bringing through the lens of sports, opening up those wider conversations? Or
Yeah, like I exclusively write about, with the exception of like the media criticism from 4 years in film school and career as a screenwriter. Like I am my only goal in terms of writing about sports is to write about the intersection of sports and politics on a level beyond and like conversations deeper than the ones Kaepernick opened up, which were extremely valuable conversations. It's like I'm also on like a hiatus from journalism right now. It's like one of those things where like It turns out you can work as a screenwriter, but really is like feast or famine. So like once I'm working on like a network show right now and a couple of features I got hired to write. Once those are done, I'll probably take a step back and restart the podcast and start writing editorially more and more. Who knows when that might happen? Hopefully March, but like that's always been my priority and stuff like that. And that's, I think there needs to be more people in that space, but they are coming, right? There are a few right now, some much, much better and bigger than I am. And there's going to be more, right? And that's fantastic. Like those are the things that we need to talk about within sports and that actually add layer of complexity to the narratives that we all love.
Great. Well, I think that's a lovely place to end this episode. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us, Abdul. I've learned a lot about my own rhetoric, and I think I owe my partner an apology for making fun of the racing one, F1.
F1's incredible, by the way. You have to watch Drive to Survive on Netflix to get a handle on the narratives. And then next thing you know, you'll be waking up at 4 a.m. to watch, the Bahrain Cup or whatever. Yeah, F1 is spectacular. Yeah.
So I'm gonna go apologize to him right now. And I know I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us. I learned a lot. This was supposed to be an Olympics episode, but the breadth of knowledge that you have on just the sports industry as a whole is really valuable. And I'm really excited to put this out for our listeners right in time for the Olympics. Everyone can watch them, I guess. There's nothing that in order for a boycott to work, we'd all have to do it, and that's not going to happen. So, enjoy your figure skating and nothing else. And and Abdul, where can people find you?
Yeah, pretty much the best place to find me is on Twitter. I am at Marx Gasol, Marx Gasol, Gasol.
Nice.
call out my favorite basketball player of all time, Marc Gasol. I have work in Jacobin, Canadian Dimension, Briar Patch. I've been writing a lot for a new outlet called Music Movies Hoops, which they've been fantastic to work with, and they pay their writers, and it's really check them out. They're lovely. I also write for the screen. I have a film coming out in Cineplexes across Canada in May called Peace by Chocolate. I have another feature shooting in July called Queen Tut that I just turned in my last draft Friday, and I'm currently writing on a show called Transplant for NBC Universal and Bell. And there will be an episode I wrote out at some point this year.
Nice.
Nice. Wow, you're really busy. Thank you for taking the time to sit with us for like 2 hours. We really appreciate it. Amazing. Well, everyone should check you out and all of your stuff. There's lots out there, so we will link to a bunch of it. And listeners can, of course, find us on Twitter at Pullback Podcast, or you can find us on our next episode, which will be like next week. I mean, we're re-releasing old episodes, so just, tune in all the time to hear our lovely voices. Thanks, everyone. We'll catch you on the next one.